This is a great privilege this morning that we have. I have been fortunate to bring groups to Poland to hear Professor Michlic when she has spoken for our groups. I've been fortunate to also be a reader of her voluminous work, groundbreaking work. And it is a privilege today to use the essay that she provided for us, The Return of the Image of the Jew as Poland's Threatening Other, as a basis for a series of remarks that will lead to questions. First, some background to Professor Michlic. She is originally from Łódź, or as Jews pronounce this, Lodz. She is an accomplished scholar in several areas. She has followed the discourse around the historical issues of Jews and Poles, talking about the period of World War II. But prior to that, her groundbreaking work, Poland's Threatening Other, which is now in English, Polish, and in Hebrew, is what I would consider one of the most important first readings for everyone. And these books are available in those three languages. In addition, Professor Michlic has developed an important study of the fate of children during World War II and their subsequent lives, if they were fortunate enough to survive, and is currently about to publish a book entitled More Than Milk of Human Kindness, Jewish Survivors and Their Polish Rescuers Reconnect Their Tales. And this is the story of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the war from 1944 to 1949. There is a number of other important works that she has co-authored and co-edited, and it is significant, I think, that we mention them. The Neighbors Talk Back, co-edited with Professor Polanski, and currently Professor Michlic teaches in London, but she's also associated with the Brandeis University in Massachusetts. I'm going to invite you now to listen to Professor Michlic, and we will collect questions. And her desire is that we have the opportunity to respond to the questions that people have on their mind. Welcome, Joanna, again for the second time to our Freighted Legacies webinars. We're very pleased that you're with us today.
Chaim, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Dobry wieczór, dzień dobry, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I understand that the article that I've written, which a couple years ago, The Return of the Image of the Jew as Poland's Threatening Other, Polish National Identity and Antisemitism in the third decade after the end of the Communism in 1989, has been posted, and it is accessible to the audiences. I don't know how many of you have read that article. I'm not going to repeat the gist of this article because it is available. You can read it afterwards, or you can ask me questions about this text if you have any. I only want to mention that this article is the epilogue to Poland's Threatening Other, to the Hebrew version of Poland's Threatening Other that just came out, published by Yad Vashem. But it does not exist in Polish version yet. So there is an English version of this epilogue and Hebrew version of this epilogue, and hopefully it will also have a Polish version. So in some ways, I will be talking more general about the commemorations of the Holocaust in Poland, the dangers to the commemorations of the Holocaust in relations to the development of the current Polish nation under the Law and Justice government. And as some of you might know, in my work, Poland's Threatening Other, actually, I have try to understand the development of various anti-Jewish tropes from the rise of modern ethnic Polish nationalism of exclusivist type from 1880 to 2010. In this epilogue, I discuss the latest period, 2015-2020. And in some ways, what I want to do today with you, I will focus on that exclusivist ethno-nationalism that some commentators and politicians and historians after 1989 thought that nationalism belongs to the history, that would never emerge in Poland again. But now we know that this was a wrong diagnosis, and because of anti-Semitic tropes being a center of this ethno-nationalism, in some ways, the center of ethno-nationalistic ideology, and these anti-Jewish tropes are capable of changing, recodifying, reshaping themselves, and working very well in different historical periods from the pre-independence period, from the late 1880s to 2000, to the independence of Poland in 18, and then throughout the interwar period from 1918 to 1939, and then during the Holocaust, these myths could also exist freely, and they were not gone with the disappearance, with the murder of Polish Jews. And once again, they re-emerge in post-1945, and they played a very important role during the communist period, at the end of communist era, as well as we can see in the post-communist era. So what I want to do today is to present you with some of my very general ideas and thoughts about the commemorations of the Holocaust in Poland today, about ethno-nationalism, the matrix of ethno-nationalism, why it would be now difficult to get rid of it. So here I begin. So to remind us, actually, the commemorations of the Holocaust arrived in Eastern Europe only in the early 1990s. And for many local conservative ethno-nationalistic politicians, journalists, and scholars, not only in Poland, just to remind us also, the arrival was not welcome from the start. They have complained that the commemorations of the Holocaust was driven by North American discourse, by American discourse about the Holocaust, and therefore it was important from the West, without understanding the local histories of the Second World War and local sensibilities of Eastern Europeans. Now, among all post-communist states, Poland today presents the case of extreme paradoxes, because on the one hand, till today, it is the most advanced case of the transformations of the memory of the Holocaust and the struggle for incorporations of the difficult aspects of the national past into national history, public memory, and also historical education. On the other hand, since 2015, Poland presents a case of a rapid regression, suppression of the difficult aspects of the past in relations to the history of Polish-Jewish relations, not only during the Holocaust, but also before the Holocaust, before 1918, as well as in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And this is also accompanied with the outbursts of covert and overt vicious anti-Semitic tropes in public sphere, in social medias, in newspapers, in publications, variety of works that claim to be historical works, as well as in the government-controlled public TV. And of course, we also have historians, right-wing historians, right-wing journalists who support that kind of vision of Poland and use anti-Jewish tropes to show that Poland today is still endangered by Jews. In 2015, anti-Semitic language has returned onto the mainstream political saloon after being eradicated from it in 2005, a year after Poland joined the European Union in May 2004. At the conclusions to my book, Poland's Threatening Other, the image of the Jew from 1880 to the present, that the English version appeared in a hardback in 2006. So you can see that I work on that book to 2003, 2004. I covered that period. During the still liberal phase of Polish post-communist transformation, I wrote that in spite of the emergence of a strong civic, pluralistic and inclusive vision of Polishness in political and cultural life in Poland, and here I quote myself, one should not ignore the persistence of the backward-looking ethno-nationalistic vision of Polishness, intolerant of multi-ethnic and multicultural society, that this is still a living vision of Poland, not a phenomenon that belongs to its past. And I quote again, one cannot rule out the possibilities that parties such as the League of Polish Families, this particular party does not exist any longer, but it has been replaced by other radical ethno-nationalistic parties, some of whose individuals members have strong links to the extreme and openly anti-Semitic movement, such as All Polish Youth, whose ideological origins go back to interwar Poland, will become important political actors in the future. The backward-looking ethno-nationalistic vision of Poland has a hold on some sections of the population, particularly those who still struggle with the social and economic changes brought about by the political and economic transformations of 1989. And now, in 2015, this backward-looking ethno-nationalistic vision of Poland gained an upper hand in the political life, with the conservative Law and Justice coming and consolidating its power. And one of the key cultural symbolic reasons Law and Justice has come to power and maintains it successfully, comfortably till the present, as for example the May 2019 election to the European Parliament have shown, lies in its slogans of giving Poles back national pride, national honor, and national reputation. According to Law and Justice, national pride, honor, and reputation have been heavily undermined, if not destroyed, under the rule of the liberal civic platform during the rule of the Third Republic from 1989 to 2015. And as some of you might have followed the latest statements by the current Minister of Education, Mr. Czarnek, he actually claims that the education that was imposed as national education between 1918 or 1990s up to 2015 was basically anti-Polish. National pride, honor, and reputation are salient symbols in Polish national mythology. Actually, that's the truth of every national mythology. The more ethno-nationalistic that mythology of a particular country is, the more there is stress on national pride, honor, and reputation. For example, think about Serbia. The symbols are especially emotionally charged in Polish case in relations to the Lieu de Mémoire of the Second World War, a historical event which is still perceived in Polish popular memory as an era of great Polish sacrifice and Polish martyrdom solely, without any quizzlings vis-à-vis other nations of Nazi German occupied Europe. And we know that this is a very problematic concept, and yet it is still very much alive in Polish popular memory, and it is now imposed once again and promoted by various historical institutions representing the vision of national history formulated by law and justice. Here, in that vision, the wartime Poland emerges without any blemishes on the healthy fabric of Polish society that had suffered not one, but two occupations, Soviet and Nazi German. This understanding of social Polish history during the Second World War is particularly alive in the ethno-nationalistic model, and as various polls between early 2000s and up to the present shows us, this is a dominant model that is difficult to challenge and deconstruct, and most likely in time will be more and more difficult to challenge and deconstruct. In the ethno-nationalistic version of the Polish national mythology, national honor, national reputation, and national pride has specific semantic meanings, and any criticism of them is perceived as a threat and insult on Polishness. In the ethno-nationalistic version of national mythology, there is no room for critical patriotism that calls for coming to terms with any wrongs done to members of other ethnic minorities, to Polish Jews, out of moral or social necessities. There were the calls raised for the first time in the early 1990s by groups, by milieu representing the civic version of Polish nationalism. So there is no room in the ethno-nationalistic versions of the Polish national mythology to take pride and honor any other dark aspects of Polish-Jewish relations that show segments of Polish society as perpetrators, killing or taking material and sexual advantage of vulnerable Jewish victims, men, women, and children. That history does not exist. It does not belong to that version. There is no room for taking pride in overcoming the dark past and integrating into that dark past into national history and public memory and historical education. And there is no room for understanding the process of uncovering the dark past as a means to increase one's national reputation abroad. And there is no way to see the process of uncovering the dark past as saving national honor, as saving one's face. National pride, reputation, and honor are all based on the assumptions of the Polish nation's victimhood and suffering solely, with no significant blemishes. These national symbols in the ethno-nationalistic versions prove difficult, if not impossible, to be recodified, recombined, and given attributes belonging to the inclusive versions of civic inclusive Polishness. So here we have that situation today, which I think is pretty pronounced, and I have thinking about models of reworking that situation. I don't have any solutions. In some ways, Poland of 2015, 2020 represents a case of a country in which the government advocates a heavy-handed, also rewriting of the political and social history of Polish society. Of course, that rewriting of the political and social history of Polish society is not only related to the history of the Holocaust, the history of Polish-Jewish relations before, during, and after the Holocaust, but other areas, including the Solidarity movement. As many of you know, Lech Wałęsa is being erased from the history of Solidarity movement in the vision of the Law and Justice. But of course, Polish-Jewish relations in that historical policy also represent a very important element. In some ways, are the driving force of that historical policy, which is the main instrument in rewriting, reshaping the national history, national public memory, historical education. In the eyes of the Law and Justice government, to protect Polish national dignity, honor, and reputation against national dishonor, indignity, the historical policy needs to be implemented in all spheres of public life. And as we know, many Poles responded to this call positively. In some ways, we can also observe a grassroots hunger for affirmative, heroic, and martyrological historical accounts of the national past in contemporary Polish society, given the Polish society's interest in the variety of museums dedicated to the Second World War. But of course, there is also a hunger for understanding the complexities of Polish history, understanding the difficult aspects and uncovering the difficult aspects of Polish national past. But that hunger is represented by milieu groups that represent the civic version of Polish national identities, forward-looking, liberal democratic version that actually is immersed also in the vision of creating pedagogy of empathy for those ethnic minorities, for Polish Jews and other ethnic and cultural minorities that had lived in Poland for centuries. And so it is a completely opposite model of Polishness and thinking about the dark aspects of national past to the exclusivist ethno-national vision of Poland. Consequently, the Law and Justice historical policy aims to protect the ethnic Catholic Polish collective only from being dishonored by those defined as others, the Jews, Israel, and traitors, the Poles who subscribe to the model of civic Polish nationalism, the Poles who call for empathy for the Jews, the murdered during the Holocaust. But so we can see that the Jews are the enemy, the central enemy, but the other enemies are also those Poles who are seen as somehow representing Jewish interests, basic interests that are seen as anti-national, anti-Polish. Therefore, if you read Polish newspapers, and you follow the various discourses, political discourses, there is so much discussions about purifications of the Polish nation out of these elements who are not truly Polish. Once again, this is the process of purification of the nations from any elements that might be a threat to that vision represented by the current government. I mean, it did not originate in 2015, but purification is a central aspect of ethno-nationalism ethno-nationalistic matrix, and we already know, if we go back to the late 1880s, that purification, that discourse began then, but the purification became one of the driving forces during the time of independence, when Poland regained its independence in 1918. And the enemies, the internal enemies, the Polish Jews, and the Poles who were seen as the uncles and aunts of the Jews representing Jewish interests, were the central enemies then, and it seems that they are today the central enemies once again. Of course, this process of reshaping of the national past, goes hand in hand with the process, as I mentioned, with the purifications of the nations from within. So today, actually, among the traitors, we also have groups of traitors, new traitors. So the traitors expand the category of traitors. So gender studies, feminism, LGBT communities are also perceived as the traitors from within, and very often it is the Jews who are presented as the triggers or the makers, the creators of all these groups within Polish societies. They are the spreaders. And if we look back at the various discourses in Poland within the matrix of ethno-nationalisms, the Jews were also blamed for spreading socialism as well as capitalism. So this is not the first time where in this matrix of ethno-nationalisms, Jews are blamed for creating and sustaining the various traitors from within. The Poles who cease to be the true Poles by affiliations with Jewish values, with Jews in any ways. And the Law and Justice government today does not hide that it financially supports individuals and institutions of higher education that propagate its vision of Poland. The government successfully invests in building a strong parallel community of experts. Actually, as a matter of fact, I believe that this community of experts is now fully built, a counter-illiberal intellectual elite that faithfully endorses and implements its hardcore historical policy, such as the National Freedom Institute, Center for Civic Society Development, and the Institute Pilecki, yes, Instytut Pileckiego, an offspring of the Institute of National Memory, the key executor in exercising historical policy. So in some ways, the government executes punitive measures in its zero-sum war. This is a zero-sum war with the vision of Poland of civic kind, civic national kind, against the pluralistic liberal vision of national past, its memory agents, and its achievements in mnemonic practices, in building museums, such as the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk under the leadership of Paweł Marcewicz, and I could give you so many examples, and many of you know of those examples. Of course, the denial of grants and dismissals of directors of important national institutions is another measure that we see almost every day how the Law and Justice government implements. So before I end, I want to talk about the current instrumentalizations of the memory of the Holocaust. I want to go back to that topic that I discussed very briefly at the beginning, because the memory of the dark past in relation to the destructions of Polish Jews is in the heart of Law and Justice historical policy, and is in some ways, as I already said, a driving force behind it. At the end of the introductions to our book, John Paul Himke and I, that's the book Bringing the Dark Past to Light, the representations of the Holocaust in post-communist Europe, that came out in 2013. In this book, we cover the period between 1989 to 2010. So that was at that time, and even from our vintage point, still quite a good era where this exclusivist ethno-nationalist tendencies seem to be existing, but they did not have an upper hand yet in countries such as Poland or Hungary. So in that introduction, we wrote that the multitude of approaches towards Jews and the Holocaust in post-communist countries suggests that cultural heritage and historical traditions exert enduring power on national identity, memory, and professional history. Today, we see how the past hegemonic traditions of ethno-nationalistic kind, tinted by antisemitism in overt or covert form, have an upper hand in the memorializations of the Holocaust. Today, the first of the chief goals of historical policy is to eradicate critical history school of Polish-Jewish relations of the Holocaust. This is done by orchestrating a wide against campaign in the mass medias, social medias, and in institutes of higher education in Poland and abroad. This is done also via channel of Polish embassies, including, for example, the Polish embassy in London, by creating a parallel milieu of both experts and members of non-elites, strong supporters of historical policy. The current Institute of National Memory is the chief executor of shutting down the critical school of historical writing about the Holocaust. The IPN conducts a variety of conferences, seminars, and exhibitions in the country and abroad, and has just launched its new Journal of Polish-Jewish Relations. And I'm actually going to study that journal as one and analyze also the various anti-Jewish tropes presented in that journal. We also see a new pattern of launching civil court suits against historian scholars representing critical school of history writing, against Barbara and Galking, for example, an author of one of the chapters of Dalej jest Noc, and Jan Grabowski is one of the chief editors of that collective work. This is an excellent example, and I'm sure Jan Grabowski will be telling you more about the details of the civil court and, of course, the positive outcome. And yet, this is a very troubling civil court case. Overall, we see a repressive erasure of critical history field of the Holocaust studies by applying legal measures and denying funding to academic institutions and individuals carrying research into the dark national past. Jan Grabowski has spoken many times about that too. He's very concerned about the numbers of students in Poland studying the Holocaust and the various limitations and censorship around this area. At the same time, the instrumentalizations of the Holocaust is manifested in feeding on the Holocaust memorializations practices that came from the West in the 1990s to Eastern Europe, to Poland, for the purpose of acquiring new strategies for creating locally, domestically acceptable versions of the Holocaust, as well for creating commemorative practices of the Second World War along the ethnic vision. So like the proliferations of various museums. If you in Poland today, you can study the various ideas of exhibitions, the different practices of talking, even in terms of talking about the very right-wing political groups during the Second World War, such as Brygada Świętokrzyska. You can see how some of these practices, the way, the models, how we need to commemorate them, they actually come from the Western model of commemorations of the Holocaust, which is also a very dangerous phenomenon. And that new homegrown versions of the anti-memorializations of the Holocaust, this is how I call it, anti-memorializations of the Holocaust, filled with the new and old modified anti-Semitic narratives, anti-Semitic tropes, accusing Jews themselves for being responsible for killings in the ghettos, for killing Jews in the ghettos. Here, I'm sure many of you know that the Jewish police is one of the key targets. Look, this is the Jewish police. This is the wealthy Jews in the ghetto doing these dirty things to the poor Jews in the ghettos. Another key anti-Jewish trope here, narrative, is about the lack of morality of Jews in the ghettos, lack of morality among Jewish families, parents, lack of caring for families, which we find in the writings of extreme right-wing historians such as Eva Kurek and Gontarczyk. But these narratives, if you listen to some of the YouTube presentations of historians working for the Institute of National Memories, you will be surprised that these narratives are actually also incorporated and they are being articulated in their introductions. That's very troubling. And of course, this is not very alarming development in Poland, but also in other post-communist countries such as Hungary and the Baltic states. So the situation perhaps in Lithuania today might seem better than Poland, but we can argue that many of the post-communist countries have embarked on the same strategy of reworking their national history of the Second World War to emphasize their own ethnic suffering, ethnic victimhood, and collective innocence with regard to the treatment of the respective Jewish and also other minorities. And finally, what I would like to stress is that the troubling global developments, such as the culture of post-truth and alternative knowledge that we live in, we live by, and the rise of extremism, not only on the right, but extremism also on the left, might further influence future memory politics and memorializations culture and its practices in Poland and other countries of the region, as it seems to me that the different dangerous racist and anti-Semitic approaches, perspectives feed on each other. This is, of course, not only my position, but positions of other scholars of anti-Semitism today. So I can end here with the question, do we need a positive memory politics based on democratic values to counteract this process? Yes, we do, but how this positive memory politics can be introduced and when, we don't know that. And if that's possible, that's something that we can actually dwell on, consider. But the legacy of this period, 2015-2020, in my view, is not going to be easily erased. Thank you.
Thank you so much. At this time, Joanna, we have a number of questions. I believe that Dominika is going to join us and share the questions with you. We appreciate immensely this tremendous overview you've given us. And I'd like to turn to Dominika at this time with some of the questions.
I'm happy, for example, to answer. There is a question, very interesting question by David Kadar about the purifications theme, which is dated into the last century. It's very powerful. However, I wonder if it's anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism. I ask because the number of or presence in general Polish lives of the Jews seem irrelevant. I'm reminded of Nuremberg's book, Anti-Judaism, The History of a Way of Thinking. I love Nuremberg's book, Anti-Judaism, The History of a Way of Thinking, but in some ways, the anti-Judaic elements, in the case of Polish anti-Semitism, as it developed in the matrix of ethno-nationalistic vision of Poland, have been incorporated into the concept of a Jew first and foremost as an enemy of Poland. So the religious aspect is one, but there are other aspects, political, ideological aspects, social aspects, cultural aspects, and also racial aspects. We rarely talk about racial aspects of Polish anti-Semitism, though there are scholars who have done recently some research, and when Grzegorz Krzywiec is one of the key scholars of Polish endecja, for example, and he has shown some elements of that. But so the racial elements were even directed against Polish Jews who converted to Catholicism. If you read Ateneum Kapłańskie, that, by the way, as we all know, was edited by Wyszyński, Cardinal Wyszyński, before the Second World War, Ateneum Kapłańskie promoted a vision of in which conversion of Jews to Catholicism, to Christianity, doesn't mean that that Jew is a safe and good Pole. Actually, as a matter of fact, it cannot be. Zofia Kosak-Szczucka represented that vision. So in some ways, the religious element is one of the elements, but the key element that the Jew is the enemy of Poland and Polish state, Polish people on many different levels. And both the Orthodox Jew, in some ways, as well, or even more, the Jew who cannot be recognized easily, who is a convert, the Jew who actually writes Polish poetry in Polish. Julian Tuwim was such a Jew. So so this issue, of course, is very complicated. So that's what I believe. How did the Polish government respond to the 2018 conflict between Professor Daniel Blackman and many Jewish intellectuals about the future Warsaw Ghetto Museum? I mean, the Warsaw Ghetto Museum is a child of the Polish government, and that museum, as we know, at least partially, is promoted as a counterpart to the Polish Museum, and this is quite well known and situation. And Professor Daniel Blackman, in many of his statements and articles in Haaretz, promoted quite a defensive as well as aggressive position towards historians representing critical history writing, such as Grabowski and Gelking. I was quite disturbed by the tone of that writing, in my view, and of course, in academia, there is a resentment and all kinds of issues that are part of that discourse that also shape our discourses. And unfortunately, as I follow that some of the statements by by Daniel Blattman, I was shocked how many such statements tinted by resentment,
Joanna,
aggression, a part of it.
part of what I think is unknown to many of the people in our audience is that this Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto is billed as an example of the friendship between Poles and Jews, having kind of an Orwellian sound to it, suggesting almost a mocking of the period when there was attempts to have a concerted effort at friendship between Jews and Poles, and to choose the Warsaw Ghetto as the example is almost not only counterfactual, but a kind of knowledgeable, I guess the only word I can use is a kind of knowledgeable chutzpah.
I mean, it's a matter of ideology. If you want to create a museum of brotherly love and not include all the other aspects or exclude the other aspects of the dark past, then you have a problem. That museum is a biased museum, it's an ideological museum. Of course, there are many of such museums, not only in Poland these days. I mean, if you visit Budapest, the Museum of Terror, and the way it depicts the Hungarian nations during the Holocaust, once again, you see even more disturbing picture. But so we have a situation where history is being politicized, ideologized, and that's a very disturbing phenomenon. And unfortunately, because this type of a museum of in which Professor Blattman is now, I think, the chief historical consultant, is promoted in the government's media. It receives quite a lot of financial resources from the government. It teaches already, I think it has started to teach teachers, educate the teachers about the Holocaust. I'm not sure what kind of knowledge those teachers will receive about the Holocaust, because we see, what we definitely see is propagation of various anti-Semitic, overt and covert narratives about the Holocaust in today's commemorations of the Holocaust in Poland. And this is disturbing, because it's like you have a situation in we actually enter a new phase where countries such as Poland, the current government says, no, we are not we don't accept that Western visions of commemorations of the Holocaust. We now are building our own visions of the Holocaust. And we accept certain narratives of the Holocaust from the Western model of remembering the Holocaust. But these aspects are not related to the relationship between our nations and the local Jewish communities. So this is why we accept that the German were the key executors of the genocide of European Jews. So this is a history that is the way it's going to be taught or is already being taught. There will be many gaps, and it will be very skewed history, even more disturbing perhaps than the history of the Holocaust taught or untaught in the Soviet Union, because with those new layers of different biased narratives, using secondary sources of Western historians. I mean, you can use, so, Eva Kurek is a very good example of a historian. She cites memoirs of Jewish survivors, and uses works of remarkable, renowned scholars of the Holocaust to show that the Jews were responsible for killings of the Jews in the ghettos. That the Jews wanted to separate themselves from Poles. And this is a very disturbing phenomenon.
There's another question here from Professor Richard Hecht. If you were introducing contemporary anti-Semitism in Poland to a group of American students, what article or essay of yours would you select? This is, you're going to have to
No,
be...
I will. This is like a self-promotion that I don't often use, but I think I will say Poland's Threatening Other. Read Poland's Threatening Other, the book, in Polish or in English or in Hebrew. And perhaps that might be a good introduction, covering the longue durée of various anti-Jewish tropes. I think going back to that first question, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, if we go back, we can say that modern anti-Semitism, of course, in general, not only in Poland, has anti-Jewish roots. Yes, and yet the long 19th century, with the rise of modern nationalisms of different kinds, plays a very important role in the way the Jews today are perceived in Poland, and the developments, what happened to Poland before the 19th century, the partitions, the short interwar period with so many social, political, economic problems, and then the two totalitarianisms, and then the communist eras. Yes, they all play a role in many ways in reinforcing the myth of the Jew as the threatening other in the ethno-nationalistic version of Polish vision. The vision of Polish nations.
Joanna, you answered the question of what to read in the correct way. In other words, the answer to the question what to read is to read more, and to read more in depth. And I do heartily recommend your book, The Jew is the Threatening Other, as a vital reading for someone who wants to understand these questions. The answer to every question about history is to read more history. Thank you. That's a very appropriate way for you to answer. And we are appreciative of your presence and your sharing your knowledge today. We look forward to having you as a part of our continuing series of freighted legacies. And I just want to take a moment to thank our participants today, and to remind everyone that we will hear from Jan Grabowski on October 10th, and invite you to read the essay. It's not required, but it is helpful, that was written by Samuel Kassow, reviewing the massive study of microhistory that was part of the suit that eventually was overturned in Polish courts, but it is the process of how it came to be a subject in courts. Normally, history does not end up being adjudicated in courts. It's usually adjudicated among historians who argue back and forth. That whole removal of the process of history into a politicized arena will be part of Dr. Grabowski's talk. Also invite you to put on your calendar one of the accomplishments of Beit Polska and Rabbi Walter Rothschild, who was for a couple of years our rabbi of reference. We have translated into Polish a 650-page translation of his book, The Honey and the Sting. And we're going to discuss not all 650 pages, but really the idea of why is it necessary to have books in Polish that introduce or perhaps reintroduce Judaism in a modern key for in the language of Polish. We are excited for people's participation in Freighted Legacies. We invite you to share information about our work. We also invite you to go to our website and to support our work. And we again want to thank Professor Michlic, and I'm going to just turn it over to Marek, who I think has a greeting wishing everybody a happy Sukkot, Chag Sameach.
I also wanted to wish everybody Chag Sameach, Chag Sukkot Sameach, and Professor Richard Hecht could contact me also directly for further information on any particular essays.
Very good, very good. Marek?
It's always a pleasure to be here, to be part of this group.
Thank you, Joanna, so much.